the 21st. I respectfully ask everyone attending to mute yourself unless you're recognized to speak. I'll call the roll first. First Vice Chair Catlin.
Here.
Second Vice Chair Davidson.
Here.
Secretary Sloan.
Here.
Treasurer Deschelle. Treasurer Deschelle is out and excused. Other directors I see in attendance, Director Guzman, Director Tisdale. Am I missing anyone? And staff in attendance, our GM CEO, Ms. Johnson, and let's see, our CFO, Doug McLeod, Ms. Pileggi, Mr. McKay, Mr. Davies, Ms. Snell, Ms. Parrish, Ms. Knapp-Rhodes, and Mr. Kroll. And now our general counsel as well. I don't think I've missed anyone. Public comment is first. I would like to open public comment to anyone who would like to address the committee regarding any topic listed in the published meeting agenda for the current and immediately preceding month. If you wish to speak and have not already done so, please either raise your virtual hand or press *9 on your phone. During this time, the committee will not offer any comments, direct comments or responses, but if you'd like to be contacted regarding your public comment, please email the RTD board office at rtd.boardoffice@rtd-denver.com. Are there any hands raised for public comments?
Chair Geisinger, we have one hand raised at this moment. Richard Bamber is here, and it looks like he's been unmuted.
Hi
Great.
there. Good. Hi there. Can you hear me?
We can. Go ahead, Mr. Bamber.
Good afternoon, everybody. I want to speak about this proposal to limit board meeting lengths and say that, I fully understand the desire, to do this, but I would say you don't need to do it this way. There are other ways you can keep your board meetings, under 4 hours. We know that this has come in the aftermath of that infamous June board meeting, where there was two things that really happened there. One, there was an hour of public comment where the public really and operators let you know what was actually going on the light rail system. There's a simple thing to that. We need to address those issues. The second thing was there was a lot of amendments from a code of conduct being done in the main board meeting. The bylaws are written in a way that promotes amendments and resolutions being done in committees using the committee system. It asks for 3 director actions to put things on agendas, committee votes. So by the time something gets to a full board meeting, it should be pretty polished and it should be going through quite quick. I would urge chairs of committees and the board chair to, while they have privileges to put things on agendas, use that sparingly, use that only when you really need to. Use the guardrails that the bylaws already have in place. It's interesting, this action today is a discussion action, is a discussion item, and then the plan is to sort of take it away behind closed doors, and then we'll next see it as a member of the public when it pops into the board meeting. My question is why is that not coming back next month at this very committee as an action item to be voted on? And then the idea being is if something is problematic, won't get board support, it will fail in committee, which is much better for everyone and gets you to your desired aim of keeping board meetings, which generally only do run 2 to 3 hours, making sure that 100% of those meetings will be 2 to 3 hours, and you guys all will get home at a reasonable time. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bamber. And we'll be discussing this item later in the meeting, so you're welcome to listen to that, of course. All right. Are there any other hands or anyone in the queue?
Yes, Chair Geisinger, we have Chris Nicholson has raised their hand as well.
Great. Mr. Nicholson, if you can state your name, please, and you have 3 minutes. Thanks for coming.
Geisinger. My name is Christopher Nicholson. I am a resident of RTD District A. And the reason I'm weighing in is actually on the item on today's agenda on survey research. One of the one of the measures that when I had looked previously at the public opinion survey that had been done on ridership opinions and the needs of both riders and the community at large, that I found lacking in that survey was any more detailed information beyond top lines. So any kind of crosstabs on demographic information, any more detailed understanding for the sake of the public, or I'm assuming for you guys as well, that allowed those of us who had access to it to understand what subgroups within the RTD community and outside of it would be most motivated and most affected. And I didn't think that survey really captured those distinctions well, or at least that wasn't part of the public data. The other piece that I'd add to that is that in that survey, it primarily focused on riders to the exclusion of, there was a section on community, but it wasn't terribly detailed. And the questions asked were not terribly thorough. And so it was hard for me to understand, for example, what products what were the things about RTD that were not being offered that the potential riders, that people who might want to ride, were most looking for. It was more just general satisfaction. And the reason I bring that up in the context of this is that this measure is going to be addressing revenue and fare products that that you guys are looking at to potentially appeal to new customers, I assume, and to broaden out. And so I would strongly encourage you to do more outreach in terms of the thinking of the people in the community, not just as stakeholders from a public perspective, but also as potential customers. That RTD's riders are one group of people who might want to buy a fare product, but there are a lot of people out there who are not currently in that group, who are potential riders, whose voice should matter in detail and not just be lumped in with all the people who basically will, I don't want to say never ride RTD, but for whom RTD is not a serious consideration. And so I would encourage you to make a distinction there in the potential riders category and be thinking expressly and specifically about how you're going to develop the survey to reach out to those people in detail rather than just as part of a broader survey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nicholson. We appreciate the comments. Okay, anything further for public comment?
Chair Geisinger, there are no additional hands raised at this time. The only other item I would add is we did receive a letter from Greater Denver Transit, which was transmitted to the board prior to the meeting this afternoon.
Thank you. All right. There are two recommended actions this afternoon. As a reminder for the committee, staff, and anyone watching or listening to the meeting, any action items that are passed by the executive committee, even if the vote is unanimous, will be included on the board agenda under recommended actions. So the full board will have the opportunity to discuss the measure presented. The draft board agenda outline has these listed under unanimous consent, but for the board agenda, they will be listed under recommended actions. The first action is the pass-through carbon reduction grant. And the action is for the board of directors to authorize an expense appropriation to effectuate a pass-through grant from the state of Colorado to the city and county of Denver, or CCD, in the amount of $5 million for the Colfax Avenue Bus Rapid Transit BRT project. Do we have a motion and a second?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, I heard first Vice Chair Catlin as the movement and second Vice Chair Erickson for the second. I'd like to ask Doug McLeod, our Chief Financial Officer, to present this item. It's just you, correctly? Is that correct, Doug? Okay.
Correct, yes.
Great.
Thank you, Chair Geisinger, and good afternoon. So this item essentially is a grant appropriation received by the city and county of Denver to make Colfax Avenue enhancements, as the chair described. RTD is an FTA grant. RTD is the direct recipient of an FTA grant. So it's simply a pass through where RTD will receive the grant funding, pass it through to the city and county of Denver. Why this needs a board action approval is because the RTD board approves and appropriates all expenses and expenditures. So in order to follow our budgetary controls, we need to be able to reflect that this expenditure going back out to the city and county of Denver has been appropriated by the board. There's no financial impact at all to RTD from this action item, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Mr. McLeod or any discussion on this item? Great. I will go ahead and ask for the vote. Are there any no votes on this action? Okay, with 4 yes votes, 0 no votes, and 0 abstentions, the motion passes. The second item on our recommended actions is public opinion polling consultant, summary scope of work approval and contract authorization. This is for the board of directors to approve the summary scope of work for a solicitation and to subsequently authorize the general manager and CEO to enter into a contract for consulting services for strategic advice, development of a survey instrument, and public opinion polling related to revenue diversification and RTD finances. Do we have a motion?
So moved, Director Davidson.
And a second?
Second, Sloan.
Thank you. We have Director Davidson. Did I call you Erickson earlier? Sorry. I was just mushing your names together. We have Director Davidson as the movement and Director Sloan as the second. Michael Davies, Government Relation Officer, could you please present this item?
Yes, good afternoon, Chair, members of the committee. Michael Davies, Government Relations Officer, and presenting this recommended action. As you all may recall, and a bit of background on this, during the May 9th Finance and Planning Committee meeting, there was a discussion item discussed titled the Board Retreat Summary. One of the goals outlined in that Board Retreat Summary, which was from the Board Retreat on March 25th, 2023, was to seek to shore up RTD's financial position and outlook with a policy goal to create a long-term, sustainable, and resilient funding model. Earlier this month, during the September 12th Finance and Planning Committee meeting, staff provided some additional information to the board with regards to a revenue diversification working group. That working group and the Finance and Planning Committee will consider available options and develop recommendations for the board to consider in the coming months to create a sustainable and resilient funding model in alignment with the agency's strategic priority of financial success. One of the critical steps that's necessary in decision-making and understanding of a viable path forward to address potential TABOR impacts and alternative revenue sources is having reliable information on public opinion and willingness to support a potential ballot measure. So if this is approved, staff will prepare a solicitation seeking consulting services to accomplish several tasks related to assessing opinions of registered voters. Included in the summary scope, the consultant will develop and recommend an overall strategy and timeline for completing desired polling, identify potential solutions to address financial challenges, suggest solutions for potential additional revenue that could be used to fulfill community needs related to public transportation, develop a methodology and polling instrument to capture a statistically valid sampling of registered voters within the district, conduct public opinion polling of possible solutions, including polling on specific language for any recommended potential ballot question to be considered, and then lastly, produce a report detailing the findings and offering recommendations for board consideration. So with that, that concludes my remarks and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mr. Davies. Are there any questions or any discussion on this item? Second Vice Chair Davidson, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Geisinger, and thank you, Mr. Davies, for walking through that. just, I'm curious, I know that this is really to go to solicitation. We will have to wait to see, what kind of work and work plans we would receive. But I'm wondering if either Mr. Davies or Ms. Johnson, just based on your experience, if you have any thoughts or expectations around how a project might be phased. And the reason for my question is we're headed into, the next legislative session here, and just thinking about, if there's interest, if the legislature is talking about potential bills related to funding of transportation, would you foresee having a phased project where we would prioritize some deliverables ahead of others, and just even an overall sense of phases and timeline? I recognize we're really early, but just really looking to your past experience and thoughts, just to get a little bit more of an understanding around that timeline would be really helpful.
Great. Ms. Johnson, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you very much, Second Vice Chair Erickson. Oh my goodness, I did that. See what you did,
It's
Madam
catching.
Chair? Yes, Second Vice Chair Davidson. So basically, this will lay the foundation for us as we go forward. First, we have to understand what's the problem for which we're trying to solve for. So what's important about us going forward with this solicitation is creating a framework so we can garner a better understanding. And how we phrase this, having a strategist, we need to develop a strategy and then be highly communicative. So as we talk about what could occur in the legislature, this will help us better understand the path in which we're taking by polling to help shape those questions, and then utilize that information upon relaying it to the board for your direction, your collective direction, to discern what the path may be. So does it appear to be optimal for us to take any steps in 2024, recognizing there's other entities perhaps vying to do something of a similar nature? And so this may give us an opportunity to rally around with other initiatives if that provides us the framework in which to do. So really, we won't have an understanding until we first identify a consultancy that can help, and then basically shape the path forward. I'll yield the floor to Mr. Davies as well, because we both have experience in other places, but really we are starting at ground zero, whereas, at least in my experience, we already had an understanding of about what the task was, and it was more clearly identified, i.e. building projects to accommodate, the 2028 Olympics. So we know what we had to do. So that was already shaped. It was basically getting people to rally around to see if there was a willingness to devote additional resources to ensure that the city of Los Angeles could put on its best face while hosting, the Olympic Games. That's what I would offer up, and I'll yield the floor to Mr. Davies if he would like to share his experience. Thank you very much for the opportunity to offer those comments.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Mr. Davies, you have something to add?
Not much to add on, but to Director Davidson's question, I think, yes, that would certainly be something that we would ask our consultant and seek their advice on. And really part of the entire process of bringing on a consultant is providing all of the background information so that they're as aware as possible of what may be coming and can offer a potential phased path that might not be realized yet, but could be realized in the near future. And that would provide a good path forward on getting the most complete information we could.
Okay, great. Thank you to both of you for the great answers and the additional context on the thinking there. Really helpful. Thank you, Chair.
You're welcome. First Vice Chair Catlin.
Thank you. And actually, you captured some of the concerns that I had about the scope, and I was involved prior to 2004 with some of the fast tracks polling, and that, much like your experience in Los Angeles, Ms. Johnson, was very prescriptive, and this is much more amorphous, where we're really trying to, as Director Davidson sometimes says, we're trying to build the plane while we're flying it. So I just appreciate your explanations, and I think that that's a good strategy. Given the public comment that we had regarding this a little bit earlier, it seems to me that we have some opportunities to shape the questions and tweak it a little bit as we go along to try and accommodate some of those concerns. So that's all I had. I appreciate the explanation and also the question, Director Davidson.
Thank you. Director Guzman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In the scope of work, it does say that they will develop a methodology and polling instruments to capture statistically valid sampling of registered voters within the district. Is that inclusive of those persons who are either using American Sign Language, not speaking in English, Spanish speakers, Portuguese speakers, Vietnamese speakers, other groups that I can think of off the top of my head that will play a pivotal role in any kind of vote that might be taken forward? And are we very clear about that in terms of what we're looking for in a scope of work from a vendor that might be able to provide those services? Thank you.
Ms. Johnson.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. So thank you, Director Guzman, for the question. I do want to qualify that this is a summary scope of work. It's a framework. Just want to ensure that there is an understanding that we would not be having an open and fair competition if in fact we are being very prescriptive in what we're presenting to the board for its consideration, recognizing that we do have a very diverse metropolitan region that basically utilizes 21 safe harbor language as we've identified in our language assistance program under the Civil Rights Act. We would leverage what our past experience has been to garner a more in-depth viewpoint. So yes, that is an option that would be available. And I don't want to speak too much because this is a summary scope of work, as I indicated, and we will be working on documents for solicitation that would carve that out, but we recognize the importance of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So you can be assured that we will take that into consideration, or not in consideration. We will be leveraging that going forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else, Director Guzman? Okay, great,
No.
thanks. I just appreciate staff moving this forward. I think that getting this kind of strategic advice and ultimately some polling will be really helpful for the board and staff to decide how we move forward on some of these Tabor and finance issues coming forward. We have a motion and a second. Do we have any no votes on this action? With 4 yes votes, 0 no votes, and 0 abstentions, the motion passes. All right, September board meeting agenda review. Sorry, was there? Before I ask for a motion to approve the September board meeting agenda, I want to note that staff sent an email to the full board yesterday asking that the 2024 to 2029 midterm financial plan, item C on the draft board agenda, be postponed until the October 24th meeting. I'd like to go ahead and pull that item as requested and note, as previously mentioned, that today's action items currently listed as D and E on the draft board agenda will be moved to recommended action. Additionally, I'd like to add a discussion item for September's board meeting on the 2024 draft legislative and government relations program. Is there a motion to move the September board agenda as amended to the board meeting on September 26th?
So moved.
moved. Sloan.
Okay, second.
Second, Catlin.
Okay, here, Director Sloan is the movement, Director Catlin as the second. I think that the midterm financial plan, then we will put on the October 24th board meeting. And, I wanted the discussion item for the draft legislative and government relations program. It's important to bring it to the board as a discussion item now, and that will come back to the committee and then the board as a recommended action in October. All right, we have 5 discussion items on the agenda this afternoon. The first item is the monthly government relations report for September 2023. Mr. Davies, you are on.
Yes, thank you, Chair, member of the committee. Michael Davies, Government Relations Officer.
Hold on, I think we need to actually vote to approve the agenda. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. All right, we have a motion and a second. Are there any no votes on this action to approve the board meeting agenda? All right, with no votes and 4 yes votes and no abstentions, the motion passes. Okay. Now there are 5 discussion items. Mr. Davies, go ahead on the September report.
Thank you, Chair. Michael Davies, Government Relations Officer. Just have a brief government relations report for you. At the federal level, really the focus is on the appropriations process and passing a continuing resolution to keep the federal government open beyond September 30th. I attended the CASTA conference last week, and the regional administrator, Cindy Terwilliger, did mention on behalf of FTA that one of the big changes in the IIJA was that federal FTA workers and employees are not subject to the regular appropriations process and are now funded out of the Highway Trust Fund. That was a change that was made in the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. And that's a good news for transit grants and the formula grants, so that if the government does shut down, they are funded out of the Highway Trust Fund, therefore continue to stay at work and are able to process grants. And so I mentioned that and Mr. Williger's remarks at CASTA, just to say that grants that RTD relies on from the formula perspective, those will be able to continue to be processed by FTA in the event of a shutdown. Obviously, there are other impacts, though. If a continuing resolution isn't agreed to, and if the federal government does shut down, a lot of the competitive grants are impacted, and FTA will have a difficult time being able to move forward on those without a full year's appropriation. So that's really the focus at the federal level. At the state level, we are really tracking the work of the interim committees, in particular the Transportation Legislation Review Committee, TLRC. They began their work in midsummer. At their last meeting on August 21st, they outlined a series of bills that they are trying to advance. And the interim committee, at least TLRC does, they get 5 interim committee bills that they can advance and basically put a stamp of approval on from the joint committee and then move to be prepared and ready for the beginning of the session in January. And so out of those, they advanced 10 bills during the August 21st meeting. During the next meeting, which is October 3rd, 2023, the committee will vote on 5 of those 10 to advance. Just to note, 2 of them that are transit related. One of them is going to extend funding for the ozone season transit grant program. And that's the grant program that funds Zero Fare for Better Air. Included in that bill is a separate track of money that would fund Zero Fare for Youth programs, which obviously RTD is in the midst of implementing our 1-year pilot program with Zero Fare for Youth. So this is a bill that would potentially offer funding for continuation of Zero Fare for Youth programs. Second was a bill by Senator Priola and Representative Dixon that would really create a committee to look at the potential of a statewide transit pass and include personal income tax credits related to transit passes. So that's really the work of the TLRC, and we'll be tracking that closely and the work that they do on October 3rd and report back to the board next month on those matters. And then lastly, at the local level, as you all know, we work hard to make sure that we're transparent and responsive and meet and try to develop good relationships with our local municipalities. And just want to note a couple of events that we participated in. On August 30th, GM CEO Johnson, Board Chair Geisinger, and myself met with the Mayor of Broomfield, the City and County Manager of Broomfield, and other Broomfield staff to discuss enhancing partnership opportunities with them. It's a good meeting. And then lastly, GM CEO Johnson, Director Whitmore, and myself participated in a study session with the Adams County Board of Commissioners and covered the topics of the partnership program, people power, and our Zero Fare for Youth initiative. And with that, that ends my report, and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davies. I see First Vice Chair Catlin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to make mention of the serious bike accident that Faith Winter suffered. And I don't know if there would be an appropriate message that we could send from the board wishing her a speedy recovery. That was quite disturbing. So I'm not sure if that would be appropriate or not, but I just wanted to say that personally, my thoughts are with her and wishing her a speedy recovery.
Thanks for raising that. I think we're all wishing her a speedy recovery. It sounded very scary. It sounds like the prognosis is good, but she had some serious surgery. Director Rosenthal had written asking about it, and Jack Kroll and I talked, and I think what we're going to do is have a card for board and staff to sign on Tuesday that we can send over to you. Does that sound okay?
That sounds perfect. Thank you.
Director Davidson.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Davies, thank you for the report, as always. First of all, thank you to Mr. Davies and Ms. Johnson and Chair Geisinger for supporting that meeting in Broomfield. Really appreciate that effort, and I know that there was some juggling of schedules to make that happen in person, which I think is always helpful. So thank you for that. Mr. Davies, just a question regarding some of the bill concepts you were discussing when you were discussing the TLRC. The idea for zero fare for youth, unlike the ozone funding, is the idea for that to be then in perpetuity?
Yes, Director Davidson. The way it's written in the draft bills is to be a continuous appropriation for those programs. And so, yeah, I believe I read it as really making it a permanent program that does not sunset and hopefully receives a continuous appropriation from the General Assembly.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. That's it.
Great, thank you. All right, Michael, you're on again for the 2024 Draft Legislative and Government Relations Program, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Michael Davies, Government Relations Officer. This is just a discussion item on the draft 2024 Legislative and Government Relations Program. As the committee may know, the board approves a legislative program to give direction and guidance and allow for staff to be effective during the legislative session, which can move quickly. It is also a document that allows for the board to take positions on bills and creates a process for that to happen and add items to the legislative program throughout the legislative session. And so before you is the draft of the legislative program. Not a lot of changes from last year. Beginning at the federal level, there are no changes really, and that is due to policy at the federal level is really set through the authorization bill, the Surface Transportation Authorization Bill, which in this case is the IIJA or BIL, Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. That authorization bill is authorized through federal fiscal year 2026 and really sets transportation policy at the federal level for that period of time. And so the work, and it's outlined in item A there, implementation of the Surface Transportation Authorization Bill is for RTD to engage with our advocacy organizations such as APTA, work closely with our federal delegation, work closely with US DOT and track rulemakings and implementation practices that US DOT are taking to implement any of the new policies that are outlined in the BIL. So we'll continue that. Discretionary grants is, of course, the other one. That is not a new item, but we'll continue advocacy, tracking discretionary grants, working with our municipal partners, working to see how we can constantly align RTD priorities with priorities of municipalities and counties around us, and see how we can leverage local funding to apply for these federal discretionary grants and bring home the federal bacon, if you will, on the discretionary grant side. On the state side, no changes from last year except for one, and that really is item E under the state section, and that is to support legislation to provide funding for RTD's Zero Fare for Youth program. As you all may recall, during the discussions around the system-wide fare and equity study, the Zero Fare for Youth program was included in that, and there was certainly a desire to seek outside funding sources on that matter. And so want to put in support for that item in the legislative program. And as I mentioned, there is the potential and seems to be a little bit of traction with the General Assembly that agrees with that notion of providing a little bit of funding to help support those programs statewide going forward. And so we'll see what TLRC produces on that matter. And then lastly, on the local section, again, no changes from last year other than a slight change in wording on subsection B in the local section, and that is the sub-regional service councils and RTD call for project partnership program. And that was just a change from last year. It was, we are going to stand the program up, stand the sub-regional service councils up, and implement the project partnership program. And this year it is really just a change in the wording to say we are going to continue that work, working with our municipalities to improve that program and work closely to make sure that those sub-regional service councils are effective and achieving the goals in what we laid forward and trying to create those in the first place. So with that, I will conclude my remarks and happy to answer any questions.
Are there any questions or any discussion on this item? I have one. First, a comment, I guess, that, I think this is a really important piece to be bringing forward, because while we will vote to support or oppose specific legislation, this allows Mr. Davies and our lobbyists and others to engage in initial conversations. Michael, if the TLRC, when they get a drafted bill, do we need to wait until it's introduced before we take a position as a board? Or could we take a soft position or something, or what's your thought on that?
Well, certainly, I think by when the legislative and its staff's intent to bring the legislative and government relations program for approval by the board next month, and with the approval, it certainly lays out intent for staff moving forward in the 2024 timeframe that the board will be supportive of a Zero Fare for Youth program that is funded at the state level. And so that would give a lot of direction to staff, and I think our legislative advocates to speak on that topic. But pending the actual bill itself, I mean, at the direction of the board, we can always bring that back as a specific bill, but really the intent of outlining it and including it initially in this legislative program was to get board approval at the general concept of creating a grant program that funds Zero Fare for Youth at the state level.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. Thanks, Mr. Davies. The next proposed bylaw amendment to set a time limit on board meetings. Jack Kroll, the executive manager of the board office, will introduce this item.
Thank you, Chair Geisinger. So the proposed language was sent around to everyone on the executive committee, and that's before you. I think the purpose of our time today is really to hear some initial thoughts and feedback on this proposed change. One thing that I want to note relative to the public comment received earlier is the bylaws stipulate that there must be notice provided to board members of a forthcoming change to a bylaw no more than 10 days or no less than 10 days prior to the meeting in which those changes are to be discussed. As such, the intent is to bring this item back as a recommended action at the executive committee meeting in October, so long as it has the support to do so from the conversation today. But I would just note that, at some point you have to lock in your changes if the changes become too substantive, you may want to reconsider, whether that item comes back in October for action or deferred to November. Point being, you don't want to send language out to a board 10 days in advance, do a bunch of changes, and then bring it back as an action item. I don't think that would necessarily be in the spirit of your bylaws there. So with that, certainly open to any feedback and conversation on this item.
So just to be clear, because I don't think this is the way the little schedule is set out, but this would come back as a recommended action unless there are too many changes. It would come back to the executive committee as a recommended action and then to the board as a recommended action.
Right. And if at the time it comes as a recommended action to the executive committee, the committee makes significant changes to the proposed language,
yeah,
I don't think it's in line with the spirit of how your bylaws are written that you could simply forward that along for the November meeting, or excuse me, the October meeting.
Right. Yeah, I think that the little outline of the schedule doesn't include coming back to the executive committee, but I think we want to make sure we do that. So great.
Sure.
Others with comments, questions? Director Davidson.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I just would like to say I'm supportive of this change, and I'm appreciative of the comment we received from Mr. Bamber in the public comment section. And I think this came up when we first discussed this a while back, and just wanted to acknowledge that thinking around some meetings do just go long, and something that Secretary Sloan had brought up, and I think I had discussed when we discussed this a little while back, was that part of setting the timeline is also just forcing us into the preparation and the efficiency of the meeting. So, not many of our meetings do go over this, but it can happen. And I think sometimes when it does go over, it's from that lack of preparation, and we get to the amendments to the amendment to the amendment. And I think having a time limit when we're going to have a lot of agenda items in many ways is a forcing function to ensure discipline and the preparation. And rather than this be about getting home on time, which I know that term has come up a handful of times, I think it's more about making sure that we're remaining efficient and that folks are fresh and focused. So I'm supportive of this, but just wanted to acknowledge I've heard other directors, and then we did have the public comment bring up the concept of, well, are we don't want to shut down discussion or things that would be long. I don't think that's the intent. Certainly, if there's just a night that needs to go very long, I like that we have the ability to vote to extend that. But for me, this is as much as about meeting preparation as it is about the actual, time limit itself. So thank you. That's all.
Any other comments? I have a couple. I appreciate your comments, Director Davidson, and I agree. I think this is a way of helping us be more efficient. I talked with Mr. Kroll earlier. The provision that says a meeting may be extended by a majority of vote present and voting board members. Should there be a vote to extend the meeting, such a vote must affix the time certain to adjourn. I don't know that we necessarily need to fix a time certain. If we fixed a time certain, I guess I would want to have the opportunity to extend it again if we got into a conversation that we wanted to keep going. So I guess my recommendation would to say may affix the a time certain to adjourn, because then the board can decide on that. Any other comments on that? I guess somebody could make that a motion. Director Sloan?
Yes, I agree. I think that is a good change, and I appreciate your bringing that up. And I totally agree with Director Davidson's comments. Thank you.
Thank you. And just a little more information. I asked the board office how often this happens. We've had 3 meetings this year, one of which I think is a committee meeting that went over 4 hours. 2 of those went over 5 hours. So it does happen, and I think that probably a number of those we would extend them and continue the conversation and all of that. So I think that's an important provision. Should we just, can I make that amendment, Mr. Kroll, or does somebody else need to propose?
We can accept the feedback and incorporate it into the next draft of this.
Great. All right. Anything else? All right. We have the board expense policy update. Thank you to Jack Kroll and Tysheree Parrish, board operations manager, for providing this. Do the 2 of you have some comments to present on the expense update?
Yes, I'd be happy to just walk everyone through the executive summary that was provided, specifically the section on key proposed changes. We, I think, haven't necessarily looked at this document in a while as a group, but it's been 4+ years since it was last amended, or right around 4 years. And so I think it's good, healthy practice to just revisit these types of things on a regular basis, and set them on a review cycle. One of the other things that came into play as we looked at this policy was the fact that the agency has recently redone its policy governing travel for employees. And we wanted to see if there were opportunities and places to align the board's policy with that of the agency. And that is the key. One of the key changes here is replacing out-of-state per meal and incidental expense reimbursement with a per diem system that would be set by, every year there's an annual output from the federal government's GSA unit that effectively sets the per diem reimbursement rate depending on where someone is traveling to. And that's the system that we would recommend the board adopt for directors traveling out of state. It's a more streamlined and effective system for tracking expenses. And it also, in many senses sets an upper limit as to what directors can expect to be reimbursed for expenses incurred when traveling out of state. We had for many years been and have been running a practice by which the board office is covering the cost of conference registration for the first 2 conferences of each director, first 2 out-of-district conferences that a director travels to. And we felt it was most appropriate to bring a dollar value amount to that more transparently forward. We actually budget for this in the annual board office budgeting process every year. So we do have a dollar amount that we can hang on that, and have done so in the proposed changes here. And we just think that's more transparent, and every director kind of has an appreciation and understanding. So instead of now covering the 2 registrations, we would cover, the board office provides funds for directors up to $1,800 to cover registrations for out-of-district conferences. And that's just the budget item that's, every year has been there, divided by the number of directors. We've modernized business expenses to include changes in airfare and hotel pricing. I don't know if you've noticed, but airlines are now sort of a la carte charging for certain things. And so we wanted to make explicit some provisions in there for directors to understand what would be covered as an expense. There's been several directors since I've started who've indicated interest in obtaining an RTD cell phone. And the process was outlined in the previous policy for how that could occur. We just are cleaning up that language and making it more explicit. One of the things to note is that the agency as a whole has a much more efficient way of handling expenses for RTD issued cell phones. So for example, my cell phone that I have access to as the board office executive manager is paid for through a centralized budget. That's a much more efficient way than what we were using, which is a line item in our office's budget. And so that would be the system we would move to if a director had interest in using an RTD issued cell phone. And then we're just more clearly identifying acceptable expenses in this policy than had been previously outlined in the existing policy. Then the couple other items that I want to make sure that I mention, we are adding some dates in there around when expenses should be submitted for reimbursement. There are two primary reasons for this. One is, it can become a significant burden on not just board office staff, but accounts payable staff across the district as we head into the end of the year and closing out, a given fiscal year's books and opening up the next year's fiscal books. And so sort of enumerating and outlining those dates will allow for more efficient processing of director expenses and reduce the burden of staff at the end of the year. Additionally, there are important IRS considerations and guidelines around timelines to seek reimbursement. For example, if you exceed a certain number of days before requesting a mileage reimbursement, it can actually be considered taxable income to the recipient of the reimbursement. So we want to make sure that we're bringing the reimbursement schedules and guidelines and dates into alignment with IRS practices on that. And the final thing I'll mention here is, should these changes be adopted, they would take effect in January. The idea after this group discusses here, we would forward out to the full board for consideration, bring back for further discussion in October's executive committee meeting, and then have it passed by the board or not at the October full board meeting. Although any changes to this policy would not take effect until January. And that's just simply to align with the fact that we've operated for most of this fiscal year on the existing policy and want to start with a clean sheet for next year. Excuse my language. And with that, that's all I got.
Thank you very much.
Oh, I should say Taishrei is on our board office support and operations manager. Taishrei, did you have anything to add that I might have missed on this?
No, nothing to add, but I'll be happy to be here to answer any questions that might come up on the changes.
Great.
Thank you both. Director Sloan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and also thank you, staff, Taishrei and Jack. You've presented this in such an orderly fashion, but I know it was not orderly when you started with it, and I appreciate the work that you put into it. And I think in general, it's definitely an improvement on our current practices. I do have one suggestion, and this is in line with the intent to identify acceptable expenditures, and it has to do with tipping. Tipping, if ever there's a slow news day, that's what a story is going to run about tipping practices. And, it's one thing dealing it with your own money, but quite another dealing it with the public's money in RTD. And I think it would be reassuring to add a sentence in the proposed policy change saying that there will be updates at relevant intervals on tipping guidelines, so that, I know you can't put one in this policy because it seems to change frequently, but I think we don't want to be the most generous person out there, and we don't want to be the stingiest, and across the board guidelines would be really helpful. It could be separate from this policy, but referred to in the policy. Thank you.
That seems like a really good suggestion, and I mentioned it earlier. Mr. Kroll, did you have a response, or Taishrei, either one of you?
Yeah, so I think that the concern is very valid. You know, I know that at the University of Colorado, another large, you know, quasi-state entity that has a significant amount of you know, state funds expended in which, you know, tipping may be an appropriate expense. You know, the policy there is 20%. You know, you should never tip more than 20%. Additionally, you know, the move to per diem for out-of-state travel and expenses should accommodate, you know, informal tipping. But I think we've also entered into a time where, you know, you might take an Uber or a Lyft, and there might be a gratuity sort of expected to be included. And we would reimburse, you know, I think the idea is that we would reimburse, you know, as your expense for the Uber or Lyft to get to where you were needing to go, whatever gratuity you were included. But Director Sloan raises a good point. You know, what should be the standard, you know, limit for gratuities on a service like that? And what's the guidelines there? And so we can certainly take that feedback into account and bring some additional language on that back in October.
Dr. Davidson.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Secretary Sloan, thanks for bringing that up. So really good point. And I just wanted to add in that, Mr. Kroll, something I liked that you said early on in the presentation was opportunities to align with the other policies of the agency, which, as you talk about the burden on accounts payable and you know, all of our various staff members, I think any opportunities we have to align are good. So it might be if we have an agency-wide tipping policy, probably a good thing to borrow from and add in here. And yeah, anyway, thanks for doing the work to align us with the rest of the agency. Any opportunities we have to do so, I think is good.
I agree. Anyone? I have a couple of comments. Anyone else first? I know I raised this once before, and there was some controversy, at least from one or two board members. But I think, you know, that with the opportunity to align with the staff and the taking some of the burden off of the staff in terms of payable and the board staff, and also I think Mr. Kroll had a really good point when you said that this puts a cap on what people can spend that hasn't been there in the past. So thanks for all the work. I have a question because it's come up with a board member in the past about community non-transit events. And there's a sentence in 9.0 that says participation in community non-transit related events is supported by RTD with approval of the benefit to the agency. Is that a chair's approval? How do we do that? And you know, I think there are a lot of chamber events that people go to. You know, does it get more squishy if it's a, you know, a local nonprofit event? You know, in terms of how we make these decisions. And I don't know if that's been fully thought through. We can talk about it later if we need to.
Yeah, and I'd be happy to have Taishrei chime in on this as well. But reading this, you know, it does seem to be an area where some additional clarity is warranted. You know, I think one of the provisions we placed elsewhere in this policy is really just a nod to the fact that this policy can't conceivably cover every, you know, potential expense, and the expenses of unusual or non-ordinary nature should require additional approval and scrutiny. You know, I think the original intent of this language, as it's a section that didn't receive significant revision, or much revision, I should say, is that if RTD were, say, going to an event, I can't think of one directly off the top of my head. Dr. Cog is certainly transit oriented, but you could imagine there might be another event that RTD had a presence at that was administrative or transit related, an administrative presence at a non-transit related but community event. This section provides freedom for the board to expend some of its monies to also attend. You know, maybe there's like a here's maybe an example, which would be, every year there's a annual, party for the regional mayors. Doesn't necessarily have a specific transit focus, but it could be a good event for RTD to have a presence at. And this section, anticipates that directors may, want to acquire tickets to go to something like that.
Yeah, I think that's a good example. And I'm thinking of a situation that came up with a director who's no longer on the board where their area really needed a small amount of money to do something at a bus station. And I actually can't remember if they were able to use their local account for that. I think they were, to help their city, use their local, by using their local account in that way. So that kind of thing comes up too. Let's see, Director Tisdale.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Actually, relative to that specific item, that was Director Shelley Cook, who wanted to be able to use $1,000 from her local fund to be able to help with, I believe it was a bench at a station. And initially, my thought was that it would be a nice idea, but that it might not be allowed. I took it to the executive committee while I was chair, and the committee voted not to allow it, just because it was outside the description of expenditures that we allowed under the policy. We did say that perhaps at some point in the future, we might look at those funds differently. This might be an opportunity should the executive committee choose to submit a proposed revision to the reimbursement policy to the full board for everyone to weigh in on that subject. But in fact, in that case, it did not turn out that Director Cook could use those funds in that manner, which was not well received by Director Cook.
Ms. Snyder. Thank you, Mr. Director Tisdale.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to highlight that the context that we're talking about right now is an expense reimbursement policy. And that there is some ground for that in the RTD statute. I think the scenario that Director Tisdale was just talking about with a prior director request is wholly outside a reimbursement policy. And I think I'd recommend a broader discussion about whether it's appropriate to use RTD funds for projects that directors would like to see funded. We have our call for projects partnerships. We have, other frameworks in place for those kinds of things. And I do also just want to caution about using the language. I have heard sometimes directors reference to their local funds. And I think we just have to be careful. All of these funds are RTD funds that are supposed to be used for an appropriate purpose. And again, this conversation is in the context of reimbursements for appropriate expenses, not being spent, not funds to be used for particular projects.
Thank you. Director Guzman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would just like to say I'm really proud of doing this work. So thank you, Jack. Non-transit related events sometimes look like the Servicios de la Raza Gala. With RTD supported that, right? Our staff had a table, but I also went separately from RTD, not knowing that we were there. And so it would have been nice to know that I could have potentially, been able to request some of the district's local expense money for that event, as it wasn't directly related to travel, but we are partners with them. And another one that's happening even tonight is the La Jefe and La Jefa Mi Casa Resource Center gathering to have a discussion about community issues within District C, but also those issues affect the entire region. And I think this will be really impactful for doing some of that work where it's not directly linked to a transit conversation, but transit is always underlying part of it, especially with my community, where we need to figure out how to get to things and how to move people around. And if we're really living up to our mission of connecting people, I think that this is a great move. So I just wanted to weigh in on that part. Thank you for doing the work. I appreciate it. It looks really good, and I'm really proud to work with you guys on this. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you. I think that's a good example, and I'm not sure what the answer should be in terms of, you know, what we're supporting and not supporting. We all have nonprofits and groups that we, you know, support, but this is something that may be coming up from time to time, and we might want to think about at some point. Anyone else? All right.
If I may, Chair, I just want to recognize, you know, a lot of the work that was done on this was done by Taishrei, and she identified this, you know, right from the outset of my joining the board office and the district as a top priority to address. And so recognition is due to her for getting these changes this far. So
Thank you very much. And thank you, Ms. Parrish, for all your work on doing this and for making it a priority. It was time to get it done, and we appreciate it. All right, the final item, executive session Zoom recording access. Jack, it's up to you again.
Yeah, I think this can be, you know, the queue up for this can be pretty straightforward. You know, there's been some requests by directors to come in and view recordings of executive sessions. In the past, you know, the need to come in was a technological one. You know, we had physical recordings of executive sessions, and directors have raised the point, well, since we've now moved to a system whereby we're using Zoom a lot more, this was a remote meeting to begin with, why do I necessarily need to come into 1660 Blake to review that recording? You know, obviously there's, you know, a practice in place right now that asks directors to come in and view those, and given the switch in technological capabilities, the board office is just looking for some guidance from you all as to what types of practices around viewing executive session recordings you all would like to have.
Okay. Questions or discussion, Director Davidson?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Kroll, for opening up for feedback here. I have I think just a thought that as we explore this, I'd like to make sure we keep an eye on, which is the IT and cybersecurity component of this. So there's probably a broader discussion in terms of cybersecurity practices and IT considerations for directors and devices and passwords and authentication and so forth. So I just, you know, I'm someone who's always on the go and traveling and you know, an engineer. So technology, you know, I'm excited about, and I certainly would love the opportunity to be able to review sessions that I'm not able to be there in person for. I do think that would be good. I just want to make sure that as we investigate that, we're dialoguing with IT with a specific focus on cybersecurity and considerations. And then, of course, with our General Counsel, Melanie Snyder, and her team on all the related interdependencies of those. And it may be that we have a broader discussion to have around board IT practices in the future, but I would leave that to some others to discover. So thank you for the time. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Second Vice Chair Davidson. I think that's a very, very good reminder. We have been joined by Director Rusha. Director Rusha, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I was one of the directors who requested to view a previous executive session remotely, and that was granted once, and I appreciate that. So I would posit that if we are currently meeting remotely for executive session, which we are, without any additional IT or security overlays, that we should, you know, allow, you know, the same for remote viewing post haste, or to Director Davidson's point, we should just stop having executive session remotely. We are, we don't have stay-at-home orders. We are able to conduct business in person. So if there is no health reason for us to be meeting remotely, and we are meeting remotely out of convenience, then if we need to have an executive session and that session is planned in advance and we know it's on the agenda, then we all need to come down to Blake Street if IT is and security is a consideration. So I think that if this is something that needs to be worked out and needs more time before we can come to a decision, then maybe in the interim we just stop having executive sessions remotely, because I think what Director Davidson brought up is a good point, and just to follow that logic, we should be consistent. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? Mr. Kroll, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think if it doesn't appear as though, consensus can be reached in this discussion here, if there's broader issues, we can certainly keep the current practice in place, which is just to require folks to come down to 1660 Blake to review these items. And I do think, there was a discussion just prior to this meeting between General Counsel Snyder, Ms. Parrish, and myself around, as we continue to have executive sessions, and now, the reality of our world is such that moving forward in perpetuity, what are the chances that there is not at least one director joining a meeting remotely into the foreseeable future? For example, we've already received indication that one of our directors will have to join remotely for next week's meeting due to a work obligation. So that complicates, how we even want to approach recording executive sessions and providing access to that. So it's a bigger issue that potentially the board needs to grapple with before providing direction on this. And for context, the requests to view remote executive sessions, we've had, I think, maybe 3 or 4 since I've started. There's not a significant inundation of these requests.
Director Davidson.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate it. And thank you, Director Ruscia, for the comments about it. This has got me just thinking about a whole other aspect of this, which is the cybersecurity aspect. I mean, I think, Mr. Kroll, to your point, I think the probability is pretty high that on a go-forward basis, there's going to be remote participation. And I think, I think it's an important thing to contemplate. And we're getting to the point now where business as usual practices are going to start to form. I personally am supportive of maintaining virtual options even for executive sessions. And if those exist, then I think it's fair to say some type of remote viewing, is something we should have available. So I like that idea. I just would encourage us to, again, follow some of the best practices. We can't be the only ones going through this and thinking about this. In fact, I know certainly from a private sector standpoint, we're not. There are some things out there, and there are tools for, adding dual factor authentication to, downloading files and, having to have an RTD address and confirming with our phone number, for example, to be able to download on a device, or even setting expiration on files. There's things out there. I wouldn't be the right one to identify those and settle those. I guess just since you brought up looking for some consensus, Mr. Kroll, I'd like to voice my support of solving this problem and having that be possible, both having executive sessions remotely and being able to view them. But let's take a look at what the best practices are. I also don't think we need to, if we can't solve it right away, I don't think there's any rush, to reprioritize other things going on within IT right now. So we could keep the practice as is for a little while, but I'm glad we're discussing it, and let's just take a look at what others are doing.
Thank you, Director Ruscia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also just apologize, I forgot to start my video. I also just wanted to add, when I did request to view the session remotely, I assumed a staff member, I'd have to schedule it with a staff member. And so that it was like a live viewing, if that makes sense, maybe over a Zoom session. And so that might be something that we could consider. It doesn't take care of all of those IT considerations, but for whatever it's worth, I took my LSAT remotely. Most everyone does these days, and that was pretty high security, and that seemed to work out. So, I think this is all solvable, and maybe we just need a little bit more time to figure out how to do it. But I also just wanted to express my appreciation to the executive board for having this conversation and putting it as a discussion item for today, because I think this is something that we need to address. And so thank you for your leadership on this. And also thank you, to Mr. Kroll for, the work that you've put forth. And I'm sure you'll, need to put forth to help us through this. So thank you very much. And I appreciate the time you've given me to talk.
You are welcome, and I agree with you that this is solvable, and I think there's some good ideas and issues are raised. We have a governance study session scheduled in October now, and that would give us some time to think through the process a little more and come back with something that maybe answers some of these questions. That sound good to you, Jack? Okay. All right. And that sounds good, I assume, to others. Thank you. Are there any other matters to discuss today? Director Tisdale.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Just very briefly, and it's a question to be posed and left for later response, because I note that General Manager CEO Johnson is not in the meeting with us any longer. And rather than raise this at the board meeting, I wanted to do it in the context of the executive committee. And that is a question regarding the status of the A-line naming rights. That's a contract that expired in May of 2022, which is 16 months ago. And we knew that that contract would not be renewed over 2 years ago. And so that means that we have lost at least $2 million in revenue. And when we speak of revenue diversification, and we have a working group now that the chair has, that the general manager has put together on this subject, I would think that would be one thing that's found money. And we should have an update on that. And whether it's in the context of a comment at the board meeting, which I don't know is necessary, but at least a memorandum from general manager advising what is the status of that pursuit and when can we start making money on that again. Thank you, Madam Chair. That's my only comment.
Thank you, Director Tisdale. Mr. McKay, can you please make sure that moves forward to our general manager CEO for management?
Doing that right now.
Thank you. Okay, I figured. Anything else? Any other matters? Okie doke. Director Davidson.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I know I think most of us are on the performance committee here. I just wanted to remind everybody that we've got a couple performance committee meetings coming up, and if you haven't had a chance to respond to the board office yet, and Teshre, thank you for sending out the email, and Jack, thank you for getting everything all teed up there. Please just respond and confirm attendance. I did have an opportunity to speak with General Counsel Snyder yesterday, just again confirming understanding on the contract. I think we have a couple things that we need to do in addition to having the survey reports that will come before performance committee. We need to take a look at what we're going to do with the compensation analysis with Gallagher through the lens of the compensation philosophy that we just passed as a committee. So really, I just wanted to highlight for the group here to please make every effort to come to those performance committee meetings. I think we're going to have a couple of things to take care of before the end of the year. So I guess I'll just leave it there, and thanks for the attendance and participation so far.
And thank you for your work on that. All right. Anything else? If not, the next executive committee meeting is scheduled for Thursday, October 19th, and this meeting is adjourned. Thanks, everyone.